In today's video, I'll be talking about how much money you need to save in order to achieve financial independence. Now, financial independence could mean different things to different people, but what I will be focusing on in this video is how much money you need to save in order to cover all your basic living expenses such as housing, food, travel, and so on. There are various popular rules such as the 4% rule, the 10x income approach, and others that give you a number you need to become financially independent. However, often these approaches do not explain the fundamental logic behind those approaches, which might prevent you from feeling confident in those numbers. So in this video, I'll break down the fundamentals and explain in very simple language, helping you build a simple calculator that will enable you to estimate the amount of money you need to become financially independent. My name is Kanak and welcome back to my channel. For more content from the world of investing, finance and economics, subscribe to my channel and show your support by liking the video and dropping your thoughts in the comment section below. Let me begin by explaining how the money you save can help you achieve financial independence. Think of your money as your employee. This employee, named savings, goes out and earns money for you. Now imagine you have two kids to feed, named inflation and living expenses. Your employee savings goes out every day and brings back some money home, called returns. Now, a part of the returns is eaten by inflation and the remaining part is eaten by living expenses. The most important point here is if your returns are unable to feed inflation and living expenses, then it will reduce the ability of savings to go out and earn enough returns. And if the returns are consistently lower than inflation and living expenses, then your employee's earning ability will keep on reducing and one day you will lose your employee called savings. So in summary, the goal of savings is to generate returns enough to feed both inflation and living expenses. So this tells us that our goal is very simple. That is to arrive at the amount of savings we need to generate enough returns to cover both inflation and living expenses. That gives us a very simple mathematical equation. Returns on savings equals inflation plus living expenses. For the mathematical calculation in this video, I will use someone living in the United States as an example. However, this approach is equally applicable whether you are living in India, Canada or any other country by just replacing the number in the simple equation with the equivalent of your country of residence. Alright, first let's talk about the living expenses. Different people can choose to live differently once they achieve financial independence. Depending on the lifestyle they choose to live, the living expense number would vary for each individual. Now, the average living expense for a single person in the United States can typically range from $3,000 to $4,000 per month. So the annual expense for a single person would typically range between $36,000 to $48,000 each year. However, for our example, we will round off and assume $50,000 as our living expense goal. Depending on your personal expectations of your lifestyle after achieving financial independence, you can choose to pick a number higher or lower than your current living expenses. Now that we have talked about living expenses, let us talk about the next most important part of the equation, which is inflation. Over the last 20 years from 2004 to 2024, the average inflation rate has roughly been about 2.5%. There have been times when inflation hit a record high of 9%. However, for most of the time over the last 2 decades, inflation has been closer to the average of about 2.5%. However, just to be a bit safer, we will assume a slightly higher average inflation rate of about 3% in our calculation. After living expense and inflation, the third critical variable in our equation is returns. Now, your returns will vary depending on your asset allocation, which means how much you put in the stock market and how much in fixed income assets such as bonds or savings accounts. Achieving financial independence without investing in stocks will be very difficult because stocks are one of the very few asset classes that beat inflation by a huge margin over the long term. And for most part, bonds and savings accounts barely beat inflation. However, unlike stocks that can be volatile in the short term, bonds and savings accounts offer stability to the portfolio, which will enable you to steadily withdraw money from your portfolio. So you need to construct a balanced portfolio of stocks and bonds that will provide you with a return that will exceed both inflation and living expenses. So for our calculation, we will construct a portfolio consisting of 70% stocks and 30% bonds. If you are a risk-averse investor, you can choose to reduce your stock allocation down to 50%. However, that will reduce your overall portfolio returns because over the long term, stock returns exceed bond returns by a huge margin. Now in the US, over the last 50 years, the S&P 500 has delivered roughly about 10.5% returns, whereas over the last 20 years, the short-term government bonds have delivered returns between 2 and 4%. So in our 70-30 portfolio, we will assume that 70% of your savings in stocks will generate 10% returns, whereas the remaining 30% of your savings in short-term bonds will generate about 3% returns. Remember, past performance does not guarantee future returns. However, we will use historical returns as a guiding light because at this point in time, that is the best information we have to estimate our future gains. Now, the weighted average returns for 70 stock and 30 bond portfolio will be about 7.9%, which for simplicity we will round up to 8%. Now, your savings will generate returns of 8%, whereas inflation is about 3%. Which means the real returns on your savings after subtracting inflation are 5%. What this means is you can withdraw 5% of your returns without reducing the purchasing power of your invested savings. This is a very important point that you do not want to overlook because the value of cash decreases with time. So you want to reinvest the 3% returns to ensure that your invested amount maintains its purchasing power. You can use the 5% withdrawal to cover your living expenses of $50,000. So to get to a final savings amount, you simply need to divide your living expenses, that is $50,000, by your withdrawal rate, that is 5%, which gives you a savings number of $1 million. So 5% of $1 million is $50,000. However, that $1 million will keep growing at 3% rate, which is equal to the rate of inflation, keeping its purchasing power intact. Now, if you think 5% withdrawal rate is too aggressive and want to keep a safety buffer of 1% in case of short-term fluctuations, then you can choose the standard 4% withdrawal rate. However, at a 4% withdrawal rate and $50,000 of expected annual living expenses, you will need $1.25 million to become financially independent. Remember that your stock returns are not linear. Some years, your stock returns may stay flat or even decline. So for those years, you might not see the exact 8% return. In the year where your stock portfolio declines, you should not sell your stock investments, but instead use your bonds or savings account money to fund your living expenses. Volatility in the stocks is the reason you have to include fixed income investments such as bonds or savings accounts in your asset allocation. One of the unique approaches to withdrawal is a dynamic withdrawal plan, which simply means you withdraw less money in the year the stock portfolio does poorly, whereas you can choose to withdraw more in the year where the stock portfolio performs well. So to summarize, the way to calculate the amount to achieve financial independence is very simple. Subtract inflation from the expected returns of your portfolio. Subtract a 1% as a safety buffer. Then divide your expected annual living expense by that number. Thanks for watching the video till the end and show your support by subscribing to the channel and liking the video.